Welcome to all the Bethel people who are joining us this morning, and to Todd, who is newly reelected, as we all know. And the focus of his talk is going to be the intersection between his Christian beliefs and his philosophy, and how he sees that play out in the legislative process. So that's what I think you're going to talk about today.
And yeah, I think that's a good start. We'll see. You can see if that's what I actually talk about by the time I'm done with all this.
All right. Well, it's all yours.
Great. Well, let me share my screen, everyone. It's great to be with you. I wish we were in person. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Yes.
So it was great to be with you. As I mentioned in just before, if you were in the Zoom room, Dottie and I have been talking about this conversation for much of 2020, and so it's good to actually be with you. We've been flexible, as you need to be with COVID time, but this conversation had taken a few forms, and I wanted to talk about Dottie was wanting me to talk some about the philosophy of the common good as it comes to the campaign, but also talk about racial equity and racial justice in Minnesota as well.
Can I also just insert, please mute, if you're just listening, please mute so we don't pick up any outside noises. Thank you.
Hey, Gordon, can you hear me okay? Is my volume level all right?
Yes.
I can.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Very good. So I'll be talking both about the common good and racial equity in Minnesota and legislative work. And hopefully we can see together how, for me, this is rooted in my faith perspective too. But I'll begin by telling some of my story. And we'll see if my computer is cooperating with me here. Yes. All right. Oh, okay. So on the left of your screen, you see my home church. I grew up in Larchwood, Iowa, in this small town of 700 people, and went to this UCC church. My parents were both from Baptist families, but they started attending this UCC church because my mom was an organist, and they needed an organist, and she could play, and so they said, "You're hired." And we landed in this church. But what is important about my story as it relates to politics is I'm political only because I'm a Christian. I grew up in a house where we didn't talk politics at all. I remember asking my dad who he voted for in what ended up being Clinton's first term, and he said, "We don't talk about that at our house." And I realized later that he had some painful experiences with his family in politics, and more than that in the community. But we did not talk about politics. My political awakening happened in church and in seminary too. So when I was in high school, we had a young pastor drop out of the sky from Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he had been steeped in liberation theology. He studied with James Cone, the leading Black theologian in the United States, a legendary figure. And so I started hearing from the pulpit that Christianity was about justice, and that Christianity was about liberation of the poor, liberation of those who needed God's deliverance. And that's what the Bible and the tradition was about. And I could see why that mattered. I could see why that movement of Jesus would be so powerful and why someone would die for that. And I had a great upbringing in so many ways, but I'd been teased plenty and bullied plenty. And so the notion that the love at the heart of the universe was drawing the outcast in and was working constantly so that this world was fair was something that really resonated with me. I left home to go to college. I went to the University of Iowa, assuming I was destined to be a music teacher like my parents, and got to the end of my degree program and didn't want to do that and discerned a call to seminary shortly after, and was in seminary from 2000 to 2003. I was at United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities, which was in New Brighton at that time, just down the road from Luther Seminary. So I could feel the power in the Lutherverse. Like it was, I was really close to the center at Luther Seminary, but I didn't end up attending any classes there. But Paul Wellstone became an important figure in my political formation while I was in seminary, because that was the time when he was the lead voice, becoming the lead voice against the Iraq War. He also died tragically while I was in seminary. But Paul Wellstone was emerging as this lead voice while I was studying biblical prophets in Bible classes, and I could see the clear connections between progressive political themes in, at the turn of the century, and the deepest and best themes of the Christian tradition, that God wants justice for the poor, that God wants social transformation, that the prophets have this continual critique of leaders who aren't paying attention to the needs of the people, and that God is focused on meeting the needs of the people. And I left seminary with the notion that the Bible was thoroughly political, that our story from the beginning, the foundational story is the Exodus story, where Moses is sent directly to Pharaoh, to the heart of political power of the ancient world. God delivers the Hebrew slaves, but more than that, God essentially dismantles the Egyptian empire through the plagues, and then starts a new nation with the Ten Commandments that has a new way of life. And the prophets are standing on that tradition and critiquing the kings that they aren't paying attention to it. And Jesus stands on that tradition as well as a new Moses, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. And he goes to Jerusalem, not to Pharaoh, but he goes to Jerusalem similarly, and then dies on a Roman cross, which was a tool of execution reserved for an enemy of the state. And so it seemed to me that if the church was to be faithful as the body of Christ now, we would need to be engaged in politics in how we're ordering ourselves as a society in one way or another. To be faithful, this seemed to be a clear direction for the Christian community. So I left seminary very interested in rural ministry, wanting the church to be a force of change in rural communities like the one I grew up in. And my family landed, and I'm married, I have 3 children, and our children were born in Wisconsin, where I served churches for 9 years. And Sarah and I enjoyed living there very, very much. And then in 2012, moved to Northfield, where I became the senior minister at First United Church of Christ and served there until just this last February. The first time I thought about running for office was when George W. Bush was elected for his second term, and the Christian right was such a powerful force in that election. And I wondered, well, where are the progressive Christians? Why aren't they running for office? I know so many, and I admire their values so much. And why aren't they running for office? And then, of course, I asked myself, well, should I be running for office? And I put that question aside as quickly as I possibly could because it was terrifying. And that was similar to my reaction when I first asked myself if I should, maybe I should be a pastor someday. So that sense of call has been similar for me on both the ordained ministry side and running for electoral office. As a congregation, we became very involved with Isaiah, Minnesota, and we were working with other faith communities across the state and working with faith communities in Northfield, of course, to be advocating for driver's licenses for immigrants, to be doing more advocating with healthcare and on climate. And it led me deeper into politics until I eventually ran for state representative in 2018. And the theme for our campaign was the common good. And it came out of a book I was reading, The Once and Future Liberal, where the author says, the Democrats have always been about the common good. And I thought, that really sums up a lot. I like the sound of that. Now, it's been interesting because in the House of Representatives, every session begins with a prayer. And every once in a while I'm kind of one of one of the chaplains who's on call in an emergency. You can say the prayer if there's a session that comes up quickly. But whenever there's a mainline Protestant pastor, Catholic priest, and African-American clergy person, probably 2/3 of the time they mention the common good in the prayer. And it wasn't until recently that I learned that the common good is one of the principles of Catholic social teaching. And so what you have on the left here, community in the common good, is one of the principles of Catholic social teaching. It's one expression of it. I found it on the Catholic Charities of the Twin Cities website. And it says, in a global culture driven by excessive individualism, our tradition proclaims that the person is not only sacred, but also social. How we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. Our church teaches that the role of government and other institutions is to protect human life and human dignity and to promote the common good. And so in the Christian tradition, you have this concern about all of us together and how we order ourselves, and a concern about individualism and individuals having a concentration of too much power and too much wealth. That's consistent through the scriptures. On the right, you have some expressions of expression of Paul Wellstone. Trying to get my screen set up so I can actually read that. This is from Conscience of a Liberal, his book, and he's critiquing the compassionate conservatism of George Bush here. He says, but his compassionate conservatism, while praising local volunteer efforts, says there's little that government can or should do about the most pressing issues of people's lives. This is a fine philosophy if you run your own corporation and are wealthy. It does not work for most of the people. Now, I see a connection between that and this Catholic statement on community and the common good, and these two scripture verses as well. One from Psalm 82:3, defend the weak and the orphan, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. This is not just from this psalm. This is a theme of so much of the Old Testament. You were a sojourner in the land of Egypt, so remember that and care for the sojourner in the land, as well as the orphan, the widow, those who are most vulnerable. You hear that again and again in scripture. Jesus stands on that. We have this verse from a famous story at the end of Matthew: whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And I often just think of this as communion table values. So as we practice communion and are fed for the work of bringing the realm of God into the world with us, I see the communion table values as being, here's where everyone is welcome, everyone is valued, and everyone has enough when the bread is broken and shared. I'm wanting to move on to the next slide here. Sometimes I have a little lag in my and let me try again. Here we go. Okay. So since the killing of George Floyd, as we've been talking about race in an even more pointed way in Minnesota, and we were talking about it beforehand as we were realizing that with COVID, communities of color were facing disproportionate effects. But one thing that my People of Color and Indigenous Caucus colleagues have been saying to us across both parties is that Minnesota is one of the best states for white people to grow up and live. And it's one of the worst states for Black people to grow up and live at the same time. And here you have some headlines that talk about this across many statistical categories or many areas of our life. So the first is an NPR news story report ranks Minnesota among worst achievement gap states. It's talking about the educational achievement gap. There's been a lot of focus on that, whether it's ACT scores, graduation rates, math and reading scores. And we're at the bottom of the list as far as that gap's concerned. There's a home ownership gap. Minnesota consistently has one of the highest home ownership rates in the nation. Households of color, however, are much less likely than white households to own their homes. We're at the bottom of this list as far as that gap's concerned. And that also then relates, of course, to your ability to pass on wealth, inherited wealth, to the next generation as well. And that's there's a large gap there in Minnesota as well. The final headline is from a Star Tribune story. A Minnesota Department of Health report released Thursday revealed that babies born to Black mothers are more than twice as likely to die in infancy as babies born to white mothers, giving Minnesota one of the widest infant mortality gaps in the nation. And so what we were hearing from our people of color and Indigenous caucus leaders as they were leading on police accountability reform, which we passed in a bipartisan way in July this summer, and that was good legislation. That was a very important start in responding to the killing of George Floyd. But what they were saying was, not only is the killing of George Floyd not an isolated incident nationwide in Minnesota, we've had incidents of African American men dying at the hands of police, but there's a pattern across other parts of life too for people of color. This fits in with a larger pattern, a larger whole, and we need to find ways to address all of it, address the big picture. And so that's been a big focus for us in the House. One thing that we've done is we passed, let me just back up here. We started passing some legislation. Or let me talk about this first, sorry. And so that they were saying, we need to be focused on changes in policy. What's really needed here are changes in policy. And I've been reading the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. It's a great book. He's a professor at American University and is a leader in this field, but he gives us these definitions. Defines racism as the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequity. So we often think of racism as simply an individual issue, the individual ideas that we have or we hope we don't have. And it's come to the point where being called a racist is one of the most offensive things that one can be called, and it shuts down conversation in this work. But he's saying it's much bigger than that. Racist ideas are part of it, but it's racist policies combined with that, and the outcome is really important too. Then he defines racial inequity for us. Racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. So, what we're seeing in Minnesota with the disparities in different categories, we're seeing clearly that the white community and communities of color are not on equal footing when it comes to education, home ownership, healthcare outcomes related to COVID-19. The list is long. And then he calls it racist policy. He thinks this is the clearest term to use. We often talk about it as structural racism or systemic racism. He thinks racist policy is a more accurate term. Racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. So my Posse Caucus colleagues, people of color and Indigenous caucus colleagues have been saying, we have to change policy. This is about more than individual ideas, behaviors, and attitudes. There are policies that keep these inequities in place, and we have to be addressing those. So one step that we took, besides passing the Police Accountability and Reform Act, which was important, one thing we did as a House is we declared racism a public health crisis. And we did that on a bipartisan vote. Now, the debate on the House floor around race has been very frustrating, because much of the time we are debating whether or not systemic racism or racist policy is a thing at all. Many of my Republican colleagues are very resistant to that idea. What I will say is that since the killing of George Floyd, members on both sides of the aisle have been much more introspective, done much more soul searching about what's happening in Minnesota, not just within the criminal justice system, but broadly, and wanting change there. So when we had this vote to declare racism a public health crisis, it was a strong bipartisan vote. We had, I don't remember the exact numbers, but a third or more of Republicans voted with all DFL members. And also as a part of that was the formation of a special committee on racial justice to look at policies across state government and to see where are the policies that are really impacting racial equity. Are there policies that we really haven't thought about that are having a major impact? What policies can lead to change most quickly, change most effectively, et cetera. What I've been doing more and more since these conversations with my colleagues of color is looking at policies with a racial equity lens. And what you realize quickly is how policy can have an impact in so many areas in moving us towards racial equity. Whether it's good public transportation policy will have a positive impact when it comes to racial equity. The same with good affordable housing policy. I mean, I think we can see that very clearly. Education funding is one area of policy that's extremely important. If we want to be addressing the racial achievement gaps, and this is a response that Representative David Bly had when I asked him this question: how do we address this? He said, well, we need to fund our schools, first of all. And if we think through what happens there, so in Minnesota, school funding hasn't kept up with inflation since roughly 2000. And from a big picture perspective, we've had divided government for much of that time. The way that divided government has functioned is DFLers will want certain policies and Republicans will want tax cuts, and they find a deal where they can both get some things, but because we've had these tax cuts over time as a way to make deals and have divided government go forward, there's been less revenue coming in, and education has taken a big brunt of that, especially coming out of the Great Recession. And so if you're Edina or Wayzata, and less funding is coming in, you can easily go to the community for a levy, which is for raising money for basic needs. And you have a broad property tax base, plenty of wealth in the community. The number isn't that high for the individual household. It's easy to get that passed. If you're in an inner ring suburb or North Minneapolis or a rural community, and rural communities with, many rural communities have growing new American populations, it's much more difficult to get that levy passed because there are communities that are property tax poor. To keep the same staffing level, that sticker number gets much higher, and it's difficult to get those levies passed. And over time, that gap gets to be further and further between the school districts that are able to draw on the community for resources and those that aren't. And so that's a big structural issue that impacts the racial achievement gap in Minnesota. It's not the only issue, but it's a major one. So funding is big there. Paid family and medical leave is a policy that would have a racial equity impact to it. So with COVID-19, communities of color have been disproportionately impacted because many people in communities of color are frontline workers. They don't have the luxury of being able to do their work virtually on Zoom. They need to show up for work. And because they're showing up, the virus is more easily transmitted, and many are in jobs where they either are afraid to take time off, or some feel forced to work when they're sick, or they can't miss a paycheck. But if we had a clear policy in Minnesota that said every worker should be able to take time off to care for themselves or care for their loved ones when they're sick, and we're going to provide some compensation to both the employer and the worker to make sure that this can happen, and we're going to hold companies accountable for that, you wouldn't have situations like we had in packing plants this spring, where you have new American communities who many of whom felt forced to work when they were sick, and they were passing the virus around quickly through the whole packing plant, threatening the health of those workers and our food supply at the same time. So this policy, we may not think about it through a racial equity lens, but it would have a major impact on racial equity right now. Another policy that I didn't think about having a major impact as far as racial equity is concerned, but does, is increase wages for personal care assistants. This is an issue I started working on in the spring because we were hearing that people with disabilities and older adults were having trouble accessing the care they needed, and personal care assistants provide home health care home health care support in the home, but their wages are very, very low. And it makes it difficult to keep a stable workforce because it's very difficult work, and people will go work at McDonald's instead. And so we knew to stabilize this workforce in COVID, we needed to provide additional wage support for personal care assistants. So we were working on it through every month through the summer. We finally got legislation passed in October. We passed $13 million for personal care assistants. This positively impacts 55,000 PCAs across the state of Minnesota, 82% of whom are women, 60% are people of color. So that's extremely important. But the clientele that PCAs serve in Minnesota, many of them are people of color as well. One of the realities in Minnesota is that if you're white and you're aging, you tend to go into a nursing home. For people of color, many rely on PCA services instead. And I heard from my Somali colleagues and Hmong colleagues that PCA care was absolutely critical in their communities, and this was huge. And I had no awareness of the racial equity components of this relatively small area of policy until we started digging in on it. And just one more mention. Legalizing cannabis has become a larger and larger issue across the country. South Dakota just passed a referendum, South Dakota of all places, legalizing cannabis. But there's a racial equity component here because there was an ACLU study in 2014. The white community and communities of color utilize cannabis at the same rates. But if you are Black, you are 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis use and possession than if you're white. In Minnesota, that number gets to between 6 and 7 times more likely. And so that's why in states that have legalized cannabis, you'll see an effort to expunge records as well. So we see a racial equity component across many different areas of policy. One thing that we focused on in our campaign, and I'll wrap things up here in just a moment, and we can have questions and conversation from there. But one thing that we've been focused on in our campaign is that we want a state government that's working for everyone, for every Minnesotan, regardless of race, regardless of gender, faith, or geography. There are so many needs that we share in common. And if we can pull people together to focus on those, we can find ways to move forward together. Hopefully, move beyond this hyper-partisanship and find policies that speak to, what Wellstone would say, the center of people's lives. Whether it's school funding, we all need high quality, affordable healthcare. We all need excellent schools. We all need affordable housing. We all need a stable climate. And climate is another place where people of color are receiving disproportionate impact. So we need to do this work together. And in the House DFL, we're definitely starting that work. I see racial equity and climate work as intertwined and really at the heart of the work we need to do together this decade. And that'll be an area of focus for me as long as I'm fortunate enough to be in elected office. So I'll stop there and would love to have conversation with you, respond to your questions, reactions, and we'll see where the conversation goes. And I'll stop sharing my screen here so I can see you.
Here we all are. Whoops. I don't know.
And it wasn't an hour.
I'm really impressed.
It was a half an hour, which is plenty.
You know, it's probably how
Half an hour. That'd be a sermon where there'd be plenty of people going to the bathroom. So, I'm aware of that. You gotta be careful.
Anybody who has ever taught the same class for 6 periods know that you can teach it really fast by the time you get to period 6, right, Paula?
Sometimes I embellished by the 6th period.
Yeah, you can also stretch it out when you get to that 6th period too.
How do you think that COVID is going to flavor this coming session?
That's a good question. I think I just wrote a piece for the Northfield News. It'll be coming out this week, and my hope is that I was heartened by this last special session. The emergency power, neither body really brought up the emergency powers. We didn't have that discussion together because the virus is really racing out of control. And we were as close as we've been since the very beginning of the virus, of speaking with one voice as both parties to encourage Minnesotans to please take COVID seriously. So my hope is that we can make some adjustments to get COVID under control in these next few months. And that as we move into the session, the seriousness of the situation will bring a renewed focus to trying to get some things done for Minnesotans and for our health and safety. I think we need to do everything we can to support the public health response of the state, make sure that the healthcare system has as much capacity as it can have, that we are providing the funding needed for contact tracing, filling gaps that the federal government may not be filling. And then I also think we should be putting a COVID response package together, a policy that has brought into clear focus where COVID has brought into clear focus needs that were already present that are even more dire right now. So paid family and medical leave is one that I've mentioned. I think we need to pass that. Broadband access is another. We had families that were driving into town to try to find a hotspot to do homework, and now border-to-border broadband is an even more critical issue for our students, and will continue to be for small communities as the way that people work is going to be changing, and we're going to be relying on remote work more and more. And then expanding Minnesota Care is a part of that for me. We have too many families that don't have access to high quality, affordable health insurance. I think they should be able to buy into Minnesota Care to have that access. One of the key ways that nations respond to epidemics and pandemics is by making sure that people have access to primary care. And we have to make sure that people have access to that basic care. And there are just too many people in Minnesota that aren't going to the doctor because they're afraid of what it's going to cost them. So I think these are some policies that are connected to COVID that could help us meet some fundamental needs. And we're going to have plenty of people saying, well, it's divided government, you can't get anything done. And we've gotten a lot done over, just these last few months with the bonding bill, with police accountability and reform, by doing a lot of hard work together. So I'm hopeful that we can still get some big things done, and COVID can help us focus on what's really needed.
Any other questions?
Is
Be sure to
Victoria
unmute
trying
it.
to jump in?
Be sure to
Can you
unmute if you're going to
one-
ask a question.
Okay.
It's Marcia. Can you give us one example of how climate change is a racial issue?
Right. So the communities that are so right now, communities of color are more likely to be impacted by air pollution. So there's an environmental racism is a reality. In Minneapolis, you have communities of color that are whose homes are closest to industrial centers and have higher levels of asthma. And as we electrify our transportation system, one of the four main areas we need to focus on to reduce emissions in Minnesota is in transportation. The more we can electrify the transportation system, get diesel buses off the roads, get electric buses on the roads, transition from fossil fuel usage in industrial settings and in generating electricity to renewable settings, all of that will clean the air and provide a positive impact for low-income communities and communities of color. One area that I'm very interested in is climate and agriculture. And there are multiple things we can be doing there. But one is we have a lot of new American communities people from new American communities that want to farm. Latinx farmers, East African, West African community members who know how to farm, they want to farm, they have trouble finding access to land. And we can invite them into this noble work and create more resilient communities going forward, strengthening our regional and local food systems, and provide good work where dollars will be circulating in local communities. And that would have a positive, racial equity impact. I'll just say one final thing about housing. We need a massive, and this is related to climate too, we need a massive energy efficiency program related to housing to shore up housing, making it more efficient with windows, with energy efficiency appliances, etc. This would be a game changer for the Latinx community in Northfield and across the state, as their housing is often just abysmal, and it doesn't keep people warm in the summertime, warm in the wintertime, and it's difficult to keep cool in the summer too. And all sorts of energy is being poured into these homes that just simply can't hold that heat or that cooling. And if we could help shore that up so that they were more energy efficient, or there was homes that were affordable, dignified, safe, energy efficient, we'd reduce emissions, and homeowners would have or households would have more disposable income to use for other things. So those are a few examples.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question regarding the recent restrictions by Governor Walz for the bars and restaurants. Is the state legislature doing anything to provide some immediate economic relief for this part of our population? and economy?
So we're doing what we can. We along with that was another round of some support for small businesses. We had released $10 million in June for additional support for small businesses and tried to get as much out the door again with this announcement. But the place where change needs to happen is with the federal government, with the U.S. Senate. They've been reluctant to pass this support. Other nations are doing a much better job with this. Other nations are simply saying to bars and restaurants, we're going to provide the funds you need to keep you going, so that you can shut down, but you're not held financially. You're held financially harmless in the midst of this, because we want to see you to the other side. Republicans in the federal government had more of that approach at the beginning, but they haven't been wanting to do that the second time around. Hopefully we're close to a vaccine and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't think there would be much financial risk for all of us to be able to provide that sort of support from the federal level to get restaurants and bar owners through this. And it's been horrible. Large companies have been able to make it through, but small businesses have been drastically impacted. And because the state has to balance its budget, we don't have the same type of funding to be able to put a major outlay out to get people through to the other side in the way the federal government can.
Mhm. Thank you.
What about Minnesota state unemployment for those that have been affected since February, March? Are they doing anything to extend that?
We're doing everything we can. It's another, so we put as much money in on the front end to the unemployment insurance program as we could to shore it up. What the reality with unemployment insurance is that the federal government funds it, the state administers it. So we did everything we could to provide the financial support to make sure that it was going to be as administered as well as it could and can handle that volume coming in, and added some things around the edges as a state. But again, that's another federal issue. So, we're very hopeful and we're signing on to letters encouraging the federal delegation to act on providing some more stimulus. And we've seen that many in Minnesota have felt much more financial pain these last few months since stimulus funds stopped in a way that they were moving earlier this summer.
Any other questions?
Well, you talked about the state having to balance its budget, and it looks like we're going to have to do some cutting. Where are the priorities there for cutting the budget?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as the numbers have come in, they haven't been as dire as what we were anticipating early on, and so that's been very encouraging. And we're doing the work of looking at every area of state budget and every area of state government, looking at the budgets, seeing are there programs that have outrun their usefulness? Are there ways that we could restructure things? Are there places where it'd be more helpful to direct funds? I also think that conversation needs to extend to the tax code as well. There are states that have put a millionaire's tax in place, and I think we need to be looking at that very closely. We had a proposal on the DFL side to we could close some of the loopholes that the companies in Minnesota were using to shore profits off overseas to avoid taxes, and Republicans blocked that measure as we were trying to move that through. But that's really a no-brainer, and we can, I think we need a tax code that reflects our values, where we're asking Minnesotans to contribute to the common good according to their ability to pay, and large corporations too. And so when Minnesotans are sacrificing so much, we can ask a little bit more of some of the wealthiest and the most powerful corporations in our state to make sure that we're not balancing the budget on the backs of our children, on the backs of people with disabilities and older adults, and protecting those services that we really need as a state.
Thank you.
Good. We're coming. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say that we are kind of coming to the end of our time, but please ask your question.
Todd, I'm curious if you hear the voices of Minnesota Council of Churches, Lutheran Advocacy Minnesota, joint legislation. Are those voices being heard? And how might we impact and be a part of getting those voices to legislators like yourself and others?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we. Sorry, I'm a little back here. So we do hear those voices. I would also say that Isaiah Minnesota and Faith in Minnesota has been very, very increasingly powerful. And my colleagues have been saying to me, Faith in Minnesota has been the organization of the year this year, just in the ways that they've been able to be present, impact things, show the power of faith communities working together across Christian faith and Muslim faith as well. And so that work that faith communities is doing together, to say we want a Minnesota that's working for everyone, and we mean it, is definitely heard and has an impact. And parties on both sides of the aisle are very aware of that work. And so I would encourage Bethel as a congregation to be looking at ways to be joining with other groups that are pulling multiple faith communities together, so that your voice can be louder, because our faith has something to say about how we order our lives together and how our lives should be. And we need churches to be that living body of Christ, that transformational body, especially right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thanks for that, Todd. We need a sort of a Christian pep talk, and that was a very good Christian pep talk.
Yeah, it's interesting. There have been quite a few faith leaders more faith leaders are running for office right now. So I'm the only clergy person in the state legislature, but there was another pastor, I believe a Lutheran pastor, maybe a Methodist, who ran for office in Des Moines, and I think she was elected for state senate. There have been quite a few who are running for Congress, and of course the senior minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta is running for Senate in Atlanta, and it's not as uncommon in the African American community as it is in the white community. But you see more faith communities stepping in, and faith leaders stepping in, saying our tradition has something to say, has something to offer, and we have gifts to share, and we need to be a part of this conversation. So that's encouraging to me.
Okay. Well, thank you, Todd, and thank you all who've joined us this morning. I know that we're running out of time, but appreciate your interest, and we hope that we can join again in January and find someone as interesting as Todd to join with us. So thank you again, Todd.
Well, thank you. It's been just a delight to talk with you. I really appreciate the work you're doing and Bethel's ministry. And I just have to say, like, one of the highlights of Zoom is getting to see all the interesting things that are behind you as well. Artwork, voluminous book stacks.
Anyway,
all sorts of
thanks for your good work.
It's top treetop
Bye,
stack.
Todd. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Give him a hand and thank Todd.
Thank you
Bye.
so much, Todd.
Bye.
Good to be with you.
Hi, thanks.
Looking forward, I'm just going to tell you that next week we've got 2 different Bethel U opportunities. One is Karna Hauk, who was with us earlier and had to leave. She and Amy Narvison are going to be focusing on some of the organizations that they are featuring for the Alternative Giving Fair. And then Jane Runsheimer is doing a Bethel U session on positivity, self-care in uncertain times. So
Ah,
consider
Thank
joining
you for
us too.